what happened in politics that meant that, A, it became completely divisive. So instead of, I think I'm right and I think you're wrong in an argument, it's, I think I'm right and I think you're evil.
Stonewall is one of the most influential trans rights lobby groups and once gave advice to up to 950 corporations, government bodies, including the Home Office and the Treasury. Well, what were they talking about? They discussed gender pronouns, diversity and inclusion training, but they've since fallen out of favour of many corporations who have decided to distance themselves. Now this week, not only have Stonewall rowed back on their definition of transphobia, it's also been reported that they are in deficit of £800,000. To discuss their fall, I'm joined by the writer and feminist campaigner Julie Bindel, and Simon Fanshawe, who was one of the original co-founders of Stonewall and now runs Diversity by Design. Julie and Simon, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Julie, I'll go to you first. What has happened to Stonewall in the past 5 years?
Obviously, Stonewall created what we call Stonewall law, which is a fallacy. They decided that gender identity would trump biological sex and legal sex in law, and that same-sex attracted people have to recognise that gender is more important than biological sex, and we weren't having any of it because same-sex attraction means lesbian or gay or bisexual people when they're involved with someone of the same sex. And if you were to have, for example, two women who identified as trans men and claimed they were in a gay relationship, a gay male relationship, that would clearly be utterly ridiculous. And similarly, if you have a straight man who's defining as a woman and says that he's attracted to women, that makes him a lesbian, which again is ludicrous. So Stonewall, for some years since Ruth Hunt took over from Ben Summerskill as chief executive, decided, and we can speculate as to why, it looked like at the time there was a lot of funding available for working on and lobbying for transgender rights. Since she came into office, she decided that we should accept that the T, which is a gender identity, not a sexual orientation, should not just join the LGB, but should supersede it in importance and pretty much everything else. And so increasing numbers of lesbians and gay men have protested this, have spoken out against it, have recognised that our rights are not being recognised, that our needs are not being met, and they have become, personally speaking, but I know for a lot of other lesbians and gay men, irrelevant to the lesbian and gay cause, but also definitely detrimental to it.
Simon, you were one of the co-founders of Stonewall years ago, and you must have seen it's changed dramatically since. How sad are you to see the state it's in now? And at the time of founding it, did you expect it to take such a direction?
No, I think one of the things about being in at the start of something is that you start it, you do your bit, and then you hand it over. So to some extent, I think the worst thing for me to do is, it wasn't like it was when we started it, because actually things never are. So they change, and that's fine. What I think is distressing, and I've always said this, this has been my constant critique really of Stonewall, is that if you look at the way in which Stonewall went about achieving what it ultimately did achieve, so 1989 to 2014, it went from a set of discriminatory laws mainly about men, but therefore affecting lesbians, to a position of equal marriage and therefore legislative equality. If you look at the way in which it did that, it did it by creating broad alliances of people around a big principle. And the big principle was not, we are fab, you must like us, you must do what we say, you must submit to our homosexual will. What we did was we said, actually, what we'd quite like to do is to establish equality so that lesbians and gays can contribute to a society that we can all live in. So we'd like to have the option to defend the country, join the military. We'd quite like to have the option to bring up children, foster, adopt. We'd quite like the option to participate in one of the building blocks of society, i.e. a legal recognition of our relationships. And what you can do around those bigger principles is you can draw in a very broad alliance of people. So that is what actually creates the change. What's happened since 2014 is that Stonewall has turned from building those big alliances into making kind of unilateral demands of people. And actually the problem with that is it's just bad politics, because in the end, and you can see it now, is that people just start to kick against it. So, people are by and large, I worked with a fire service the other day in my business, Diversity by Design, and we take scenarios and we give them scenarios, and then people get to, discuss them on their small tables, and then we have a big discussion. And one of them involved the fact that one of the firefighters in this fire service has transitioned from female to male, male to female. And they wrote a letter to all their colleagues saying, look, this is what's happened, this is what I've done. And the sentence in the middle was, if you misgender me, don't worry, just apologise and we can move on. What really interested me about hearing these people in the fire service, both the firefighters, they call them the Green Book and the Grey Book. So the Green Book is the professional services and the Grey Book is the frontliners. Grey Book and Green Book were both talking about, really, they were perfectly happy to find some way of accommodating this, of moving on, of working it out so they could still go on preventing and putting out fires. What they kicked against was being told to apologise. In other words, what they were kicking against was the imposition of a form of thinking, speech, whatever, with which they did not agree, and in some cases which they thought was quite simply an untruth. So the thing that surprises me about Stonewall is that if Stonewall had gone out and said, the thing about trans women is that they're trans women, there are really interesting stories here, and actually what we've got to do is find a way in which we can all participate in a society where we can contribute to our best, etc., etc., etc. Actually, people would have been up for that. But if what you do is start to impose what is effectively an untruth on people, I'm not just saying that people who are trans don't exist or anything like that. I'm merely saying is that a trans woman is not a woman. There are two distinct groups of people here. And if you impose the one on the other, people will resist it eventually.
And do you think, Simon, that the rot set in with this before they went completely bonkers on the trans train with the some people are gay, get over it, very aggressive style messaging that just rankled for many people? Yeah. What do you mean, get over it?
I'll tell you what I always think of. I always think of civil partnerships. The whole point about civil partnerships, so you'll remember this was the sort of precursor to equal marriage. I wasn't involved in the discussions except very tangentially. But the point about civil partnerships was that without a legal relationship, you would not, as one half of a gay partnership or a lesbian partnership, be able to speak to your doctor and get information about your partner's health in hospital because you were not, strictly speaking, next of kin. You wouldn't inherit a house that you had lived in forever. It would go to your partner's parents if they had died intestate, and so on and so forth. Manifest inequalities. So what we needed was a legal relationship which would guarantee and require of us the rights and responsibilities that everybody else had. So if we'd gone for marriage, if they'd gone for marriage, if Stonewall had gone for marriage, they would not have got it, because in the House of Lords, particularly the religious nominees in the House of Lords, think they own marriage, and they would have opposed it. It basically would have been defeated. But the point is, what were we trying to achieve? What we're trying to achieve was that legislative recognition of the relationship. And so civil partnerships are a really good thing to do. It was a clever way of a halfway house. So on one hand, then you had people sort of Peter Tatchell and those sort of activists saying this is marriage apartheid and nonsense. It was a way of achieving civil rights for people. And on the other hand, what you had was actually a very useful socialization. And I remember saying at the time, civil partnerships, everybody will call them weddings. And sure enough, you go to a civil partnership and there is still a 6-year-old skidding across the dance floor on their knees. There's still some grandchild dancing with granny. There's still two people who are happy with each other, at least until they get divorced. It's all going well. And what people did was they started going, oh, it's like weddings. So when it came to equal marriage, people kind of got used to it. And that's how you achieve change. You achieve change by being in situations with people who change your life. And that is true for, when you change your views about race, whether you change your views about women, if you're a man, race, if you're white, you do it by being in contact with people. Do you know what I mean? So for me, the bonkersness was actually failing to what are we trying to achieve here? And therefore, what's the best way of doing it? The last thought, I think, is that I don't think the bonkersness is restricted to the whole argument around trans or whatever. I think there's a style of politics in there around identity and, the irony of people who say they're non-binary is they're the most politically binary people in the entire world. But there's a style of politics there that says that demands total agreement and separates you're for us or against us. So, sorry, last thought, but Ibram Kendi, the famous anti-racist writer in America who's just had to give up his research institute into such things. But nonetheless, his famous quote is, the answer to past discrimination is present discrimination. Now, I just don't think that's a politics which creates change. I think it creates resentment and kickback.
And I do think, I agree with you about the bonkersness and it being wider than the trans issue. I do think that the narcissism of some, not just young people that attach themselves to the organisation, but mainly young people who thought that they had a right to their own special identity, whether it's non-binary or arosexual or whatever it was. And they started to bully, and we've seen this in other institutions. They started to lay down the law and to bully and to cast themselves as the eternal victim, but without any institutionalized victimhood that they could point to. So it was all about their own personal feelings. And when it started to be a no debate, get over it diktat, then that's when we as lesbians and gay men, some of whom felt that they should be represented by Stonewall, I was never keen, I have to say, that's when they started to push back and say, hang on a minute, we're not going to be told. This is our organisation. You're supposed to be there for us. And you're supposed to actually be there for groups of people such as lesbian and gay asylum seekers whose lives are in danger if they're returned back to whichever country they had to escape from. We're not going to be involved in this awful narcissism of the eternal victimhood.
The weird thing about it is how, the famous thing about the personal is political, invented by a lesbian collective in Boston, I think. But what they were saying was our personal stories are an important way of understanding what's happening in the bigger struggle, as they would have said. And you can see that if you go right back into post-war history, you can see historians who start to say, hang on a second, it's not all kings and queens. It matters what, the diary of Victoria Wood did that play, didn't she, about the diary of the woman at 36A or whatever it was, from mass observation. These personal stories matter. However, they matter as contributions to the understanding of these bigger conflicts. One of the things that seems to happen is that instead of the personal being political, the political became personal. It kind of got washed through a level of individuality and almost therapy. So you can see it in the well-being arguments. People say well-being at work. It's not about our well-being. It's not about safety for all or, conditions at work or whatever. It's my well-being. So you find this kind of individualism, and what's odd about that is it seems to me to come from right and left. It comes from hyper-individualism in the market, the idea of, the sort of Hayek Friedman-esque sort of I'm an individual powerful in the market, which of course is nonsense. You're not. You're surrounded by all sorts of forces. But it also comes from another view, which ironically is from the left, which should be collectivist, actually seem to develop this hyper-individuality and, as you call it, narcissism. So what's peculiar is that people then confuse. You see, I don't care whether people call themselves asexual, non-binary. I really am not interested in whether, I don't mind. They can do what they like. If that's their way of expressing non-conformity, fine. The mistake is to transfer that personal, whatever it is, definition, transfer that into policy. Because the minute you if you want to say, I'm non-binary, I'm neither male nor female, well, help yourself. But you can't impose that on the material reality of other people.
And it's exactly what Stonewall does when it lauds the message, bring your whole self to work. Oh my God, I can't think of anything worse. I can't think of anything worse. Do not bring your whole self. Bring your work self to work.
I've seen you in the pub.
Yeah,
no
exactly.
one wants to see that.
But
the other in the pub, the idea of that. I mean, you bring a professional self, but you see what? So what is the root of this, though? Because Stonewall definitely took on a kind of contemporary politics, which is lazy, very self-centered, and doesn't address kind of collective issues. And if, as you said, if they were addressing collective issues, they'd stop sending out emails at the moment that say, make the UK, tell Keir Starmer to make the UK safe for LGBTQ people, because it is. What they would be doing is saying, what we're trying to do is get people out of Afghanistan because the Taliban are going to, instead of queers for Palestine, this is actually what we're going to do is we're going to fight Hamas and stop them throwing gays off the roof and so on and so forth. But they don't have that sense of collective. So my question is, what happened?
Well, Ruth Hunt happened.
Orientation is too personal, and it's such a personal story. People then took that personal and tried to make policy out of it.
Well, and also Ruth Hunt happened. This is my take on it. She came in, she wanted a clean sweep. She wanted to make it very obvious.
This was the new chief exec in 2014.
In 2014, which obviously then she left. She's now in the House of Lords. Nancy Kelly took over. Any fewer brain cells, you'd have to water her twice a day. And she's now out and there's someone incoming and I can't keep up with it. However, Ruth Hunt was clearly chasing the money. She had told some of us that she wouldn't be adding the T to the LGP when she was looking to become chief exec during that interim period. And, some of us thought that might be the case. She might stick to her word, and others thought that she was definitely chasing that funding and also wanted to be very distinct from Summerskill, who was always against adding the T. Now, I think that what happened was she surrounded herself by this trans advisory group, all of whom will have just been feeling so powerful and buoyed up by the fact that they were dictating to everyone, they were setting policy, they were bullying everyone, they were getting women and men cancelled for daring to misgender. They really had a huge amount of power, and she could see that. And she would have been swayed by that to do their bidding effectively, and then that left the door open for others to come in and say, and I want to be recognised as aromantic, and I want my identity as an sapiosexual to have an entire document all about me, and she acquiesced to that.
Right. I also know a number of people who've been involved in trans equality, let's call it that, for a long time, who were explicitly excluded from that advisory group. So I often call myself, I say I'm the wrong kind of gay. And I have a mate who I work with from time to time, a trans woman who called Jackie Gavin. And Jackie calls herself the wrong kind of transsexual, because she was definitely, her narrative on being a trans woman is being a trans woman. She has a really interesting narrative about her relationship to the person she was before and so on and so forth. I'm sure that's right. I'm sure there was a kind of chase the money, but I think what's interesting is the money was there because, that there had been a conscious strategy, not just in the UK, but across, particularly in America, to pursue this idea of transsexuality, transhumanism, this idea of gender as opposed to sex. This has been bubbling away for a long while, hasn't it? And people latched onto it almost as if it was the next. This idea of trans people are the most victimized minority in society and so on and so forth, which, thank goodness, is not true. There are simply, people aren't murdered in huge numbers or attacked in huge numbers. And in fact, they're barely attacked at all for being trans. So what I'm fascinated by is what happened in politics that meant that it became completely divisive. So instead of, I think I'm right and I think you're wrong in an argument, it's, I think I'm right and I think you're evil. That happened. So that dynamic changed. This individualism happened. And all of this centered on sex and gender particularly, although I think you can see it, as I say, in battles around race and my field, EDI, and so on and so forth. It became demanding in an unproductive way, very individualistic. But my question is, why were they stupid enough to do that? Because it constantly hasn't delivered. That's my point. I mean, you look at 2014 to 2024, the last decade, Stonewall has delivered no change.
Simon, this makes me think about how women have often responded to the gender ideology campaign. When I speak about this with lots of different groups, with gay men, lesbian women, and actually straight men as well, they all generally seem to be on board that gender ideology has got completely out of control, that there can only be two sexes. But then with straight women, a lot of them are in these charities and advocacy groups. And because they have quite an agreeable nature, they often have these caring roles. When they're told that a minority faces discrimination, they're compelled to want to help them at the cost of lots of other things.
Well, because they've been told, haven't they, that being trans-identified is a worse oppression than anything, that this is worse than the lesbians and gays went through with Section 28 or before that, because actually we have been through things worse than Section 28, but for some people they don't know their history beyond that. And that if they are heterosexual and they are not involved in any politics or community around lesbians and gay men, they will believe you if you tell them that being transgender is the worst oppression you can face. And therefore, they will also believe that this is the same as being lesbian or gay to one degree or another. The LGBTQIA+ that Simon famously said looked more like an unbreakable Wi-Fi code than any acronym that represents us. Then to them, it is all the same. So they're going to dictate back to us as lesbians and gay men, and to you when you talk to them about this, that do we not understand this is all part of the same community, and yet they haven't had their moment of liberation yet?
There's a couple of things, aren't there? There's one is, and I mean, look, I don't know this, but this is a narrative I've read a lot, which is that the sort of be kind notion is a huge appeal to the way in which women are emotionally socialized as you grow up. So so the narrative that I've read is that be kind notion, sort of building on you tell somebody, you say to a woman, somebody's oppressed, they will be, in a sense, socialized to kind of sympathize with that person. So look, I'm not a woman, I'm socialized in that way, so I bow to your superior judgment about that. But that's one element, I think, the be kind bit. And that, I think, generally plays across minorities. There is a kind of, the second point is there's a social cachet, the social value, social reward in being kind to minorities and being perceived to be kind. So, there's this phrase ally you have now in organizations. I don't like it, and I always try and critique it. I always feel like when somebody says, you have an LGBT ally, I always feel like I'm being wheeled across a rainbow pedestrian crossing in a wheelchair and looked after, protected. Yes, by a burly heterosexual man who's helping me out. Now, what you do need at work is, to navigate your way around promotions and so on and so forth, you need advocates. And, everybody I know who's ever achieved significant advancement to whatever level will say to me, oh God, it was fantastic. I had this boss. She was great. He was great. Whatever. So you need advocates. But so this ally idea is very much, I think, is built on, again, this binary power notion that some people are oppressed and other people are oppressors. And that's a kind of unshifting idea. So the powerful, the oppressors have to help the others. So I think there's a kind of mixture of stuff in there where straight women are drawn into that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of people, I find there's a lot of straight blokes who, have been sufficiently demonized, not individually, but as a group, this kind of bizarre notion of toxic masculinity, which is a sort of, people use it as if it's a tautology rather than a qualification, a subsection of masculinity. So when men get told they are the problem, rather than it being acknowledged that they have problems, what happens to men is that they need to find some way of looking nice. and looking sort of soft and liberal. And a great way of doing that. I mean, the old days, it was some of my best friends are gay, some of my best friends are Jews, and if you were really lucky, you had a Jewish gay friend, and that was like 3 cherries. And, but you need that association, because otherwise people are going to say, oh, you're just a straight bloke. And all of this is distorted politics built around notions of identity, which don't represent the whole of people's life or experience or potential or talent.
Absolutely. And I think I know what Stonewall has done is it's never given weight to the double oppression that lesbians face, being a woman, the sexism, and then the turbocharged sexism from being an out lesbian. And the misogyny has been stepped over, because now we only have victims of misogyny are trans women. So in other words, men rather than women. They've stepped over us at a time when Stonewall should have been prioritizing issues relating to lesbians. They then took the trans train on. And this is unforgivable, because they were never brilliant at advocating equally for women as they were men, for lesbians as they were gay men, in my view. And now what they've done is they've skipped over lesbians. They've demonized us. They are misogynistic, and they should fold. In my view, they are irrelevant now. We need a new organisation. We've got lots of organisations being set up, and Stonewall is now archaic and needs to go, in my view.
Certainly, there's a level of misogyny, I think, and you've seen it in gay male culture for a very long time. There is you can see it in the worst kind of drag, and I don't mean character acting of Barry Humphries and Lily Savage. I mean the kind of repetitive, imitative drag, which is essentially misogyny in a wig. That you can see it there. There's a level of racism. So I think gay men have to take some responsibility for this as well, because, that we've not done enough over the years to challenge that culture, really. And I think we've contributed to it. And I think Stonewall, to some extent, it's embraced that embraced it. It's propagated it, I think, without thinking carefully enough about it, because you do find that, when there's that bloke with the beard, with the dress, who says that he's reframing the way in which you can be a lesbian. This is a video that was on the Stonewall site for someone. It's sort of laughable, really, because it looks like a comedy sketch, but actually he's behaving like a bloke who's sort of colonizing the experience of lesbians. And you just think, get your tank off their lawn, frankly.
As my last note, I just want to say, though, I've been very thrilled and delighted at how many gay men are now recognising this and have stepped up to the mark and have decided that this is not acceptable. Lesbians have always been there for them, or some, and they are now here for lesbians. And we do have a new alliance, which I'm really, really pleased about.
Julie Bindel and Simon Fanshawe, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.